All right. How is everybody? This is episode number 51 of the Trauma Informed Educators Network podcast. I almost forgot the name because it's been so long since I've actually recorded. Took quite a while hiatus for a variety of reasons. But I knew several months back when I took a break that this would be the next podcast. And I know we've all the guests here, we've been communicating for the last couple of months, getting a date. And I was so excited to be able to have three previous guests on this 51st podcast. So I'm going to give everybody a minute to introduce themselves, let the audience know a little bit about you, and then we're going to talk about equity in education, which is something, Ingrid, I realize you are the third podcast guest, and that's been actually a couple years ago. We were talking about it then, we're talking about it now, and I'm sure we're going to be talking about it for a long time. So we'll start with you, Ingrid, if you would like to just tell a little bit about you and what you do.
Yes, I'm Ingrid Cockhren. Thank you for having me again. My background is stress and trauma. I am a psychology professor at Tennessee State University. I'm also with PACES Connection. I'm their director of communities, where I help initiatives across the country and internationally mobilize around the ACEs study as well as the PCE study. And in addition to that, I am a consultant focused on really lately how ACEs and DEI intersect. And I provide these services for a number of clients across the board, just schools, hospitals, any nonprofit or institution that's wanting to address historical trauma and DEI within their workplaces and organizations. So again, thank you for having me.
So glad you are here. And that moves me to the guest number 32 from the podcast, which is a great friend of mine and colleague, Dr. Rickey Gibbs. Thank you for coming back on. Dr. Gibbs, tell us a little bit about you and the work you're in the midst of and what you've been involved with.
Absolutely. And thanks for having me again. Hey, so my name is Rickey Gibbs. I have the honor and privilege of serving as principal at Warner Arts Magnet Elementary. I'm located in Nashville. A little bit about me, like the connection with Ingrid. I'm a proud graduate of Tennessee State University, where I received my undergrad and my master's. It's one that this work is just passion work for me. I've been blessed to be recognized as Principal of the Year during the 2019-2020 school year by 78 of my colleagues on the elementary tier. I've done some really innovative work around non-traditional approach to student discipline and just bringing awareness to the fact of even in the year 2021, we still have segregated schools, and what we're going to do to make sure that we're working hard to desegregate school, ensure that all students receive a quality education, and making sure that the zip code that a child lives in doesn't already make facts about what type of education they're going to have. So I've been trying to just knock down walls. Some people say that you can open a door and let others walk in. I believe in just removing the whole door so no one will ever be blocked again.
Thank you, Dr. Gibbs. Really appreciate the work you continue to do around our city. And that brings me to guest number, and I remember us talking about the irony of your number, you are guest number 75 on the episode, Dr. Benson. When I wrote it down in my notes this morning, I remember our conversation about that, but so glad to have you back as the author of The Unconscious Bias in Schools, which is a book that I read and was part of in Metro Nashville Public Schools, a book study. So tell us a little bit about you and the work you do.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me back again. I really enjoyed our previous conversation. I was guest number 45, and it was during a very turbulent time in our country. And so we talked about that particular number, being number 45, and what it meant for our political atmosphere at the time. But I feel really blessed to be a part of this great panel. I'm gonna have to step my game up. You know, we got some really intelligent, very thoughtful folks on here. But so for me, I'm a career educator. I was an elementary school teacher, middle school vice principal and high school principal. And then I, instead of going the superintendent route, I chose to go the academic route. And so I worked at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte for 4.5 years, doing all of my research on racism, vestiges of structural racism in K-12 education. And I wrote a book, as Mathew said, Unconscious Bias in Schools, a Developmental Approach to Exploring Race and Racism. It's available through Harvard Press. And I did that because I wanted to, myself and my co-author, Sarah Fireman, we wanted to create a roadmap for other principals to do this work and not having to learn along the way like we did, right? I wanted to create a sort of a roadmap to actually be able to enact anti-racism instead of just talking about it, instead of just having the annual diversity professional development to have conversations about it, but what does it actually look like in practice for leaders? And so to couple with that, I founded the Anti-Racist Leadership Institute for education-based organization leaders, college and university leaders, for K-12 leaders. It's a workshop series that accompanies the book so that individuals can actually learn how to get beyond sort of the normative ways of just talking about it and learning how to more be about it. And so the Institute is officially a year and 2 months old as of today. And we've had great success. We've served people from all around the world. And I feel that we're doing nothing but expanding and really bringing a different paradigm to the process of becoming, not just knowing better, but actually doing better. So again, I feel grateful to be here. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. And we want to jump right in. And I think the best way to jump in is really about the historical context. I know Ingrid and Dr. Benson both mentioned their work in this historical journey, right? And I think that I've been corrected so many times, and now I understand on a deeper level that we're not dealing with a broken system. We're actually dealing with a system that was by design continuing to be oppressive. So let's talk about the historical context. Let's talk about what we are trying to undo that has been done on purpose in this equity work, especially in regards to education. Ingrid, can you start us off with this with this topic?
Sure. So, I mean, in America, all roads go to slavery when it comes to historical context. The understanding that at that time that Black people didn't have souls, shouldn't be educated, were inferior, less than, savages, came from a continent that had no culture or civilization. And that notion, or this overall belief and value, is still prevalent today as we think about kind of the scientific colonialism that goes along with race. So as people, academic elites in Europe in the 1700s decided which groups had culture, which groups didn't, which groups were savages, which groups were civilized, this started our basic understanding of how we relate in race in America, from Europe to, Europe's colony. And so this is our basis that leads to our deficit view of African-American students, our belief that they are less able to understand, our research that shows lower IQ. All of this is lacking in context. And so the general belief is that, genetic race exists because of these academic elites in the 17 and 1800s. And because of genetic race, that means that because of my skin color, I am inferior, I'm less intelligent, I am less in need of enrichment. And that bleeds into our education system, which was always meant to be a tool of enrichment for white male students. And so what does it mean today? Well, that looks like lower expectations for Black students. It also creates structural issues like funding being determined by housing and property taxes and things of this nature. Obviously, Black people were never meant to own property. And so all of this together gives us a landscape that allows for deficit views of Black children and their families, along with the science to support this view, lacking in the context that all of these issues are rooted in white supremacy and policy, along with very clear, violent, overt racism, which is considered a toxic environment, which would impact things like IQ and issues of economic stability. So it has been, from the beginning, an issue of blaming the victim. So we have lots of deficit research, but with no context of racism, and seeing this as an issue of a genetic race, as opposed to an issue of a racist system that's been created by white people that still kind of exists today, despite issues of integration or efforts to integrate, and actually maybe even worsened by integration.
And I remember our conversation about integration, right? How that it's always perceived as such a positive thing, but there have been many negative impacts and outcomes. And I think one of those right now is the decrease of teachers of color in schools, right? That was by design. Teachers of color were pushed out of schools to make room for white educators. Historically, we know that, right? And now it's like, what happened to all of the teachers of, well, we know what happened. And I think that those are pieces that we don't have enough conversation around when we're talking about these current problems based off of historical context. And Dr. Benson, I know a lot of your work really brought in the historical context. Do you have anything to add around that? What Ingrid said about your research and your experiences?
Yeah, well, that was so eloquent, Ingrid. I'll try to add to that in my specific way. I like to bring sort of attention to the sort of the longevity of white supremacy in this country, because folks often forget just how long it was and how it represents the majority of our history as a country, right? And just how short of time we might have what we call liberation, which you don't really have liberation. We have less racist laws and forms of discrimination, but the time in which we were living under a doctrine of legal and accepted white supremacy was a very long time. And when I say white supremacy, I want to define the term so folks understand what it means. It's the belief that white people are superior to those of all other races, especially the Black race, and should therefore dominate society. It's a belief that we are truly better than every other race. That's what white supremacy is. So folks often get the definition of white supremacy conflated with white supremacists, right? As the person, but white supremacy is a doctrine that we live by in this country for hundreds of years. So even prior, like Ingrid said, everything goes back to slavery, and even prior to slavery with Native American genocide, that was based on white supremacy. We are better than you. We're better than your culture. We're better than and we're going to eliminate. We're going to eliminate you. And if we're not going to eliminate you, we're going to assimilate you to the way we live, right? And this went on for hundreds of years before the transatlantic slave trade was started in 1619. And we know that went on for 246 years. If we just think about chattel slavery, meaning that your children of children of children will always be slaves, and it's acceptable. And we have to think about the conditions under which Black people lived at this time. You could do things to Black folks that we couldn't even do to dogs today. You will end up in jail for your lifetime if you did the thing the dogs say that was legal to do to Black folks for 246 years. The pathology of that, for that to be acceptable for 246 years up until 1865. But even after that, for another 89 years, we had legalized segregation. That your people are not as good as us. So you must live over there in substandard conditions. You have substandard jobs. Maybe you can work in the service industry, but that's about it. We're not going to allow you to accrue wealth. And so if we consider the liberation, not even the liberation, but the next step in sort of the civil rights movement is the civil rights movement. And civil rights is the civil rights movement in 1965. So if you think of 1619 until 1965, that is 346 years. 346 years. That's a very long time of legalized racism, legalized oppression. But then we flash forward from 1965 until today, that's only 56 years. So you see how it's still really lopsided towards the time that that the legal segregation, how it has infected our systems and ways of being in every aspect of our society. So those residuals are still here, and that's what we're dealing with today. And that's what folks have to remember. That it was so long and so intense for so long. And then after 1965, it's only been 56 years. So it's going to take more than, that amount of time to solve racism. And that's what I put forward in sort of teaching folks just how deep this goes, is that the timeline is so long, and we have come in just a little pinprick past that. We have a lot farther to go.
And I think that's imperative to understand is a timeline. This isn't something that is so far into the past that it's unrealistic. And I think that's something that I hear even in our state. And for those of you who do not know, Ingrid, Dr. Gibbs, and myself are all in the state of Tennessee. And this idea of that happened so long ago, yet you drive down one of the main highways and there's a shrine to a general in the Civil War, as if it happened in a way that is to be celebrated. These pieces are not far from today. And so what are residual? I mean, what are things that as people of color, right, that you want to continue to advocate and fight, that you shouldn't, right? And that you want somebody, and I don't want you to educate me because that's not fair, right? But I don't know if y'all know, but I'm a white male. I'm fully aware of this. And it's my duty to learn, which is why I do what I do and why I dig what I dig into. And as a leader of a school that's predominantly of kids of color, it is my due diligence that I must do for myself to get to the point of understanding, right? So on this journey of getting here, Dr. Gibbs, you've been in this process in a school, right? And I, as a friend and a colleague, but also as somebody who listened to the podcast where you stood up in a community meeting and there was some negativity talking about your school, and you put the brakes on that conversation abruptly because there was a perception that you didn't feel was the reality. Tell me about your experience right now. And I know they don't know your story, but I do. The kid from Liberty City, right?
Yeah.
But tell me about how that space that you had to stand in at Warner when those comments were being made. Because if you go back historically, it fits into the narrative that both Ingrid and Dr. Benson were talking about.
Yeah, so it's definitely, I'm gonna make some connection to what Ingrid and Dr. Benson hit on as I go through that timeline. But one of the things that what Portell is actually the moment he's speaking on, we were having a community meeting and just talking about school integration and things of that nature. And folks was like, well, why should I risk my child's education by sending them to that school? That school just needs to be better. And that was when I stood up. I'm like, hold on. Like, you've never even been to the school, so how dare you pass judgment, and you've never stepped foot in the school. But part of the conversation is, so to give everyone just a quick overview, 3 years ago, my school still sits in the same spot. We sit in the middle of a zip code, 37206. Our zip code is 66% white. 3 years ago, my school was 99% black. So say those numbers again. A zip code that is 66% white, but you have a school that's 99% black. And you ask yourself in 2021, how does that happen? Obviously, when we talked about, school integration and desegregating schools, and you hear the whole conversation about school choice popping up. Well, parents have the right that they can send their child anywhere they want. We live in Nashville. We have a choice district. So families can be anywhere they want. But one of the things that I often tell people about choice when it comes to especially families of color, and if they're economically disadvantaged, you only have enough choices to what your finances allow. So if you have a family that doesn't have a car because they are dealing with generational poverty and they're locked into an area that is actually still a food desert and things of that nature, they only have a choice. So everyone with choices and means they make other choices, and you get those families of color locked into this one area. So you end up with a school that is 99% African American, 99% economically disadvantaged. And one of the things that I raised up the viewpoint, and we actually hit on it in the promise. Oftentimes when we're talking about desegregating schools and making sure that schools reflect the community, Ingrid and Dr. Benson hit on it. We've gone through the process of busing. We've taken Black kids and bused them across town, and we see that still didn't work. When we talk about desegregating, and one of the things that, again, we push out all the time, this isn't a Black people issue. This isn't an African American issue. Because if it was an African American issue, the issue would have already been resolved. The only way that we're going to actually work to truly integrate schools, begin to show our children what we know a beautiful society can be, is when white people begin to make the conscious choice to say, I'm going to make sure that I do my part to integrate schools. I'm going to make sure that I do my part to ensure that I remove my child out of this bubble that they're living in, to show them that there's other sides of the world. Because one of the things that I pointed out to everyone in that room, when you choose to send your child to a school that has minorities as someone who is not a minority, you're showing them what society really is. Because when we get in a room with people that don't look like us, that don't love like us, that don't talk like us, that don't believe like us, we then begin to truly teach our students, or our children, what society is all about. So when we talk about just that point, that was actually a pressure point, a turning point for not only my school, but our school community, where we began to have some real conversations about, you bought a house in this gentrified neighborhood, but you're still taking your resources and your most prized possession, your greatest resource, your child, and you're taking them somewhere else. Why did you truly buy a house in this neighborhood? So that's part of a conversation we had. And it was from that conversation that kind of spiraled into kind of just the tsunami wave that we're seeing now with desegregating the school.
Ingrid, I want to hear from you again, because as I talked about our previous conversation, so much of what you said resonated with me about this push for desegregation, and how that it might not be the best idea in some cases, right? Talk to me about that, because that's something that has just stuck with me in our conversation.
Yeah, it goes against the grain. I've taught college courses around development, and I know that I'm a bit of an outsider, so I don't think that segregated schools are necessarily a negative thing. I also am not really a proponent of mandatory public schools, and so and this is all because of the way that our society is set up and how we view education at this point. Currently, I see our education system as a way to assimilate us into white supremacist values and ideology. So I'm not opposed to having all Black schools or all Latino schools. I'm not opposed to that. What I am opposed to is there not being a very clear effort to ensure that all of our schools, especially public schools, are the same. So if I can go on one side of town and look at a public school in Green Hills area or Belmont area, and it looks great, the facility is clean, they have plenty of books, they have plenty of resources and computers, and then I go to a public school about 15 minutes away, and it looks extremely different, more dilapidated, and they don't have the resources that they need. and both are public schools that are federally funded. I mean, this is pretty obvious. There's a high tolerance for inequality in our education system. We are totally fine with it as a country. We ride past it every day. It seems to bother no one. So I don't think that the way that we are operating as far as schools are concerned in general is the way to go. I think students of color need more teachers of color. I also think that the curriculum needs to be vastly different, especially when it comes to history. And so I wouldn't, even as a Black parent, I wouldn't want to send my Black child to a public school. My friends don't like that when I say that out loud. But because I want them to understand history in a totally different way. Slavery is not kind of, our history. Slavery is white people's history. There's a totally different way to look at our events of the past within the context. All of these issues are issues of a white society, a white supremacist society that has changed the way that we parent our children. It has changed our DNA. It has changed our health outcomes. It has changed the way that we see the world and the way that we internalize, how we see ourselves. And this is not because we're Black, it's because white people are white. And so until that's corrected, then I would be, I'm wary of public education across the board.
And I think there's so much validity. For those of you who do not know, if you haven't watched the recent Saturday Night Live, Tennessee is basically the source of this whole new parody and skit because it is that embarrassing of the depth that that white communities are going to try to stop an open conversation around anything that is perceived as negative in schools. And I know, Dr. Benson, we talked about this when we had a conversation. And I think that we have to have these open conversations around what is and what is not critical race theory, and why is this becoming a strategy, a tactic of fear that is being thrown out there by so many organizations. I'm going to put that in quotes because we know it's not really organizations, it's agenda driven. But what is your take on this, and how do we continue to advocate in these spaces when we have legislation, even in our state, Dr. Benson, where it's outlawed that we can't speak of anything that has to do with critical race theory?
Yeah, there's so much said right now. I have so much to respond to, but let me start with the sort of critical race theory thing, because I gave a free community workshop like a month and a half ago, because our organization we're getting so many questions about how to respond to the critical race theory legislation. How do we respond? What do we say? First of all, critical race theory is not taught in most schools, the majority of schools. And critical race theory, if you understand, it's more of an epistemology rather than a curriculum, right? So it's just 5 pillars, and I'm not going to go through them because you can easily Google it and it comes up on Wikipedia. But most folks who are against critical race theory don't like the word race, so they're finding a way to politicize race. This is the conservative backlash to Black Lives Matter, right? I think both sides of the aisle are to blame for the current situation, right? Because I think the Democratic side try to politicize race to be the party of anti-racism. I think I remember this picture of Nancy Pelosi kneeling in the White House with like a kente cloth stole. I was like, what is this, right? Number of photo ops, like we are the party of the Black people, right? And so naturally there had to be an antithesis to that. And what does that mean? We are against critical race theory, meaning that we are not really interested in talking about the vestiges of racism. But this is not anything that's been an anomaly from how politics have worked in forever, right? Race has been a political platform for well into our history. This is not, it's just the next iteration of sort of the race argument in the race conversation. So my recommendation to those, and this is what I did during my workshop, is that folks just read the legislation, and most of the legislation is like ridiculous, right? If you go, so most of them have these 13 points about things that you can't do in schools, right? And other than Texas was very surgical with theirs, and theirs is very dangerous, right? They're usually ahead of the game on white supremacy. But most of the, Tennessee, so Tennessee was actually one of the examples. Tennessee, North Carolina had most of the states, but most of them have these 13 pillars. And if you just read them you read the bill, it just sounds like some scared white folks saying that you can't do this, you can't do that, right? You can't talk, but it really doesn't impede an educator in a classroom from actually teaching a sort of real history of the United States, right? So my recommendation is just read the bill. Most people don't, right? And those who are against critical race theory have no idea what it is. It's just a talking point, right? And so that's just my recommendation on that, because most of the legislation doesn't hinder anyone who's an anti-racist leader from doing their work, or an anti-racist teacher who's supplementing the curriculum to be more reflective of a true history. It doesn't handcuff us. But something else I wanted to say about integration. I agree with you, Ingrid. I am not an integrationist. Right. The purpose of Brown v. Board was not integration from the Black side. We were not calling for integration. We were calling for equal resources. That was it. The 11 parties under the umbrella of what we call Brown. So I taught school law and policy when I was a professor. We're not calling for integration. That wasn't even a part of the ask. But it was argued that separating Black children from white children produces an inferiority complex. They made this sort of social and psychological argument, which then, bolstered this idea of integration, which was never going to happen, right? Because it's not, according to critical race theory, it didn't produce interest convergence. Like, white folks are not getting very much from integration. But we also have to remember, during segregation, when we talk about the folks that we traditionally celebrate during Black History Month, these folks went to Black schools. If you think about all the folks we traditionally celebrate during Black History Month, they were schooled at a time during segregation. So really what we're asking for in today, and I agree with Ingrid, I'm not asking for integration, not asking for desegregation, but equal resources, right? Fair funding, and to stop being oppressed. Like, white folks, just stop oppressing us, and we're going to be all right, right? There's a great movie called Wilmington on Fire. Great documentary that talks about just how much, when Black folks begin to come together and progress as a group in any location, the white populace then has to double down on oppression. They actually burned Wilmington down and drove all the progressive Black folks and folks who were just staying to themselves and being more prosperous economically and politically, because it could not exist under white supremacy. And so the ask is, stop oppressing, not for integration, but we just want to have equal resources still. The legacy of Brown and still want equal resources and basically to be left alone. And so I'm in agreement, Ingrid. Thank you for saying that.
Hey, so this is the type of conversations that I love, because I'm on the other side of that fence, and that's where I think this is how conversations we all grow as individuals. Because I would challenge just the thought process. While I'm a true believer that as a proud African American, we can definitely educate our own. If we were to truly keep the Black dollar in the Black community, we can thrive as a community. But oftentimes we don't have ownership, or we don't produce goods. So our communities just look different. But when it comes to education, I'm not a believer that a Black educator can educate a Black child the best. I've never believed that. While do we need more educators of color? Absolutely, because children need to see people that look like them in leadership positions, and holding positions of power, holding positions of authority, so that they have something to aspire to as well. So I absolutely believe that. But when it comes to the field of education, I fall in the line of, I believe we need more, what a phrase me and Portell use all the time, we need unapologetic disruptors. And an unapologetic disruptor can be Black, white, Hispanic, Asian, doesn't matter, can teach children of color, can teach white children, doesn't matter. But as long as they're willing to speak truth to power, not water down history, and actually teach history and things of that nature, and teach children to love themselves, love their community, love their heritage, take pride in who they are and where they come from. To me, that's the thought process that I really expound when it comes to schools, as well as call me an idealist, but I believe in that utopia of a society where, Dr. King, one of the people that we celebrate all the time, alpha man, and I pledged alpha in college as well. And he talked about thinking about that day when, white kids, black kids, Protestants, Jews, everybody would play together. And just that's my thought process when it comes to that utopia. So when I talk about desegregating schools, and the reason I push for it, because I want us to get to a point in education where all children, because at one point in time, before we became all these learned adults and got indoctrinated in this belief and that belief, we just saw somebody else and said, hey, will you be my friend? Will you come play with me? It didn't matter what color you was or anything of that nature. It didn't matter if you came from a wealthy family or economically disadvantaged family. You just saw somebody that said, would you be my friend? So getting children to that point, I think, is critical. And especially as we begin to evolve as a society and we have more people that identify as that are born one way and identify another way, or make a transition or whatever lifestyle, just ensuring that everyone is accepted. And so kind of what you hit on, to me, it all comes back down to that equity conversation, and just ensuring those resources are in place. If somebody chooses, and I am, look at if Ingrid was next to me, I would look you in your eyes right now, because I am a stern defender of public education. And it's one that I talk to folks in the charter sector, private sectors all the time. Some of my good friends are in those sectors, but I'm a stern defender of the public sector. And I tell people, you have the right to choose whatever you choose, but making sure that all children have access to equitable education. And that's my biggest thing. You shouldn't, because you live in a certain zip code, doesn't mean that your school should be dilapidated or run down. And then because I live in a zip code that's one of the wealthiest zip codes in the state, now my child goes to the state-of-the-art school. That's the conversation when we talk about desegregating schools and moving resources and things of that nature. That to me has to be at the forefront of the conversation, because if we are pushing resources out, and when we talk about pushing resources out, and really when we talk about desegregating schools and really pushing out resources, it takes more money to truly educate a child that's coming from an impoverished background, a child that's coming from a background full of trauma, a child that's coming from a background where they see violence every day. It may take a different amount of money to educate that child than a child that comes from a two-parent household that's in a wealthy area. And I say that because there's different levels of trauma support that needs to be in place. There's different levels of counseling that needs to be in place. We have to level that playing field, so when it comes to the academics, both students are able to access the academics equally. And that's a conversation that, like, I tell people as we have the conversation, and I love to hear different perspectives, because I'm a stern defender of just a certain thought process that says anybody can be an amazing educator, black, white, or indifferent, if they're going to be an unapologetic disruptor and really work to disrupt the status quo, because we know education was founded on middle-class white values. But we have schools full of children that don't come from middle-class white homes. So what are we truly teaching our children? And that's why I say we have to disrupt that status quo, because like you started from the beginning, some of these systems we didn't stumble into these systems. These systems are truly created by design And we have to have the true conversation of who they were designed for.
So I see some expressions, and I want to hear from you guys, right? But here's one thing that we talked about: resources. We also have to talk about the disproportionality of the use of exclusionary practices and every other kind of punishment-driven processes that we know absolutely, without doubt, disproportionality of children of color is extremely high when it comes to the punitive processes of school. And I think what I see and hear all the time is what you guys have just said and Dr. Gibbs said. It's built on a certain sense of expectation based off of a historical white perspective. And we want kids, and I say we because I am part of a educational system, me personally, not it, in my school, the way we operate, not it, where kids come, be quiet, sit down, and do what you're told. That in itself gives me angst on so many levels. Now, do we want kids to come in and be able to learn? Yes. But do I want kids to sit down, be quiet, and do what you're told? No. I do not necessarily want that for my own child, because sometimes what we're told doesn't fit with what kids should be able to do. But I want to hear from Ingrid and Tracey on that, the dialogue. What are your thoughts with Ricky going, hey, I don't know if I agree with that?
Yeah, I'm very used to that. So most people don't agree with me on this issue, but I will say that it sounds great to have the utopia. But in the meantime, my child and generations of Black children have gone through the system. So how much leeway do you get? When I was working in the school system and years go by, and that year that went by that we didn't get it done, that's somebody's middle school time, formative years. It's not, it's very impactful. Most people of color will say that when they think back on their childhood and they have what we call encounters or core memories around racial identity, they happen in school. And they're often perpetrated by teachers of various races around low expectations and assumptions about their character, over fixation on their behavior, and there's a real cost as long as we're waiting on this utopia. And so I'm not opposed to integrated schools. I'm just in the present day. I'm in the now, which means that, I have a 3-year-old and her, sense of identity is extremely fragile right now. And if I send her to a teacher who may be well-intentioned, but still a white supremacist at heart and has racist ideology that's embedded within their teaching, within the way they see her, not just because they're individually racist, but because we're in a racist country, then that leaves me at a disadvantage. And it's also having very deep-rooted, it's embedded within her experiences as a Black person in this country. And so I would be concerned with, how much time do we give public education to get on board? They seem to be totally fine with the disparities in outcome. Also, even when they have efforts to make changes, they're so bureaucratic that if their efforts aren't effective, they'll keep going with it because they've already invested money and time. And often those efforts aren't effective because the people in the decision-making positions are mostly white, are out of touch with the field, have no historical context, and again, have that racist, belief system that we all have because we're citizens of this country, or just, embedded within this country. So I would say, how much time do we give public education to get on board?
And you said something that makes me think of Dr. Benson's book, and that's Intent and Outcome, right? I think that in his book, he talks about addressing racial situations where racism rears its head, where people don't even understand that the intent that they were trying to do doesn't match the outcome. And I'm going to be honest and tell you that resonates with me all of the time. And I have to keep myself in check, like, wait, does this intent match the outcome? And as a school leader, I'm constantly having that interdialogue. Dr. Benson, talk about that, because that's Ingrid is saying, you know, I don't want to let this happen right now. Maybe in the future, my daughter's children will have a space in which it's safe, but right now I don't feel safe because the intent, although may not be driven directly by someone who is overtly racist, the covert pieces of the system itself could have a negative impact. You talk about that in your book.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, my head is swirling. I love this conversation. This is fabulous, y'all. You know, we don't have to all agree, right? And I want to talk about the intended impact as well, but I want to sort of talk about what Ingrid's talking about as well. And it also basing education in history. We have to understand that education historically has been weaponized against people of color in this country. Okay, with the Native American genocide, the ones they couldn't wipe out, their main weapon was education. Was stealing kids from their communities, putting them in boarding schools, and stealing their culture. There's a saying from one of the generals at the time that, you know, kill the Indian, keep the man. I think it was something like that. That was their strategy, and they're all across the U.S. These boarding schools to assimilate this culture into white dominant culture, ways of being and knowing, and steal their history from them. During slavery, it was illegal to educate a slave. For 246 years, it was illegal. It was against the law. And during segregation, they left Black people to schools that were not well funded, not well resourced, and, you know, over here that did not have the same resources that the white schools had, purposefully to keep Black folks undereducated. And it would be, you know, we have to understand that this legacy continues. Education is still a weapon. That's why things are not equal. And it's a weapon because it privileges the white community. So this legacy right now, in terms of schools not having equal resources, is by design. So I do believe that this utopia somewhere out there, possibly, maybe, we could all sit together in the same classroom, have the same experience. But as far as where we are today, pursuing integration, I think, wouldn't be on my top 10 list, right? It might be number 12. Right? So I'm not an anti-integrationist, but what I am saying is that we are still in search of equal resources. Still. Now, that's something we talked about. We're still in search of equal resources in terms of facilities and funding and materials. And then also we have to talk about the inputs. So we have to think about what white schools have. So I've worked across the board in schools that were predominantly Black and brown, low income, middle income, high income white schools. So I've worked across the board. And we have to understand what these high income white schools have. So they truly have community schools. Being their teachers live in the communities in which they teach. They come from the communities. They're friends with the parents who live in the community. But unfortunately, when it comes to Black schools, especially Black and brown schools that are in low-income neighborhoods, we do not have this. We are not afforded the same luxury. That most of the teachers drive in from somewhere, and then when they're done, they leave. They're not a part of the community. And from the research I've done in terms of principal turnover and teacher turnover across the board, the Blacker and browner the school is, the less experienced the teachers are. And this is the general trend, right? These are the less desirable schools, right? And so in terms of, you know, yes, I would love to pursue integration, but integration at what cost? At cost of these people, you know, these teachers who teach in these Black and brown schools not living in the community, being of the community, and then not staying where they can get a better job at a closer middle to high income school. Right? And so we have to solve a number of layers of oppression, you know, on our way to this utopia. And if we just throw in sort of, you know, integration as sort of the answer, what integration truly then represents, and this, they talk about this in a podcast called Nice White Parents? Love that podcast, right? And when we have to think about integration in cities and towns that have pursued integration aggressively, what they're really pursuing is the political influence of the white parents who go to the Black and brown schools. To then bring in the resources, put the pressure on the school board, and bring in greater resources and funding, right? Because Black and brown folks do not have that political power. So yes, it's great for folks to sit next to each other and get along and enjoy the diversity, but we have to understand right now the way that integration has been used, when it's been used aggressively, is to bring in that influence. We're not actually solving for the disempowerment of the Black community. Okay, I'll stop.
I mean, and I hear you say that, and I've heard it. I've heard it spoken in the context locally of if this wouldn't happen in this school, or this situation wouldn't be going on in that school, or if this child was in that school, they would be getting additional support. And I think that I hear what you're saying. And so actionable pieces as educators and as yourself and people of color and myself as a white male, what are the next steps for us? What do we do in the next step to move in the right direction as a collective, right? What is the logical next piece?
In the field of education, the logical next piece is effective policies. You're not going to be changing the hearts and minds of people, especially when it comes to their children. And so effective policy in mandates can really help us to get what we want. The issue here is, and this is another unpopular opinion, but those of us who are interested in making those changes are rarely able to put language to what we want. We're also fearful of the consequences of saying the things that need to be said. And so a good example of that is I was doing some consulting with the school district in Chicago, and it was a mix of administrators and teachers. And there was this one very passionate teacher, and she said, you know, there's teachers that we know have white supremacist views. You know, what can we do about this? And the discussion was around critical race theory, along with, you know, historical trauma. And so she said, you know, we have teachers that have white supremacist ideology that are in classrooms and are doing damage. What can we do? And I was like, well, do you have a definition for white supremacist ideology? What can you do without that? Nothing. You can't do anything without it. However, one side is really good with policy and getting people in line around language, and the other side is not, because they're still fearful of saying that someone is racist, or saying that the way things are going is not the right way to be, or criticizing public education, or criticizing the individual teachers who work hard. And you know, it's just this. I don't want to say PC, but definitely one group is very aggressive in their tactics. The other group, not so much. And until we match the tactics of the other group when it comes to policy, then there's not much that we can do, because we're still trying to change hearts and minds.
So I'll follow up with what Ingrid just hit on. When we talk about some of those actionable next steps, me as a practitioner, someone who's passionate about seeing educators' voice rise up, because I believe that educators, if we're going to truly tackle some of these challenges, it's going to be us to do it. We talk all the time that people say, well, it shouldn't be educators' responsibility to fix society, but we're the one profession that touches everyone in society. So heavy is the head that wears the crown. So I believe that as educators, it's going to be critical for that term I used earlier, those disruptors. We have to find our voice. We have to begin to not only speak truth to power, but also have these conversations where you will get a Ricki Gibbs, a Tracey Benson, an Ingrid Cockhren that can have a conversation, and a Mathew Portell, have different perspectives, may not agree on every single topic, but the one thing I will say we all agree on is that we want to make sure that all children are successful. So we just have to figure out, how do we go about that process? So making sure that those disruptors find their voices. I believe that community organizers, it's time to stand up. We have a lot of people, and Ingrid kind of hit on that point. We have people that are passionate about communities, passionate about how to build them, but can't quite figure out how to really get that momentum moving. So how do other people who have that skill set and understand the politics and things of that nature can work with some of our community builders, our community organizers, to really give them the backing and pushing that's needed so we can truly advocate for our communities? Because one of the things you, Ingrid, eloquently talked about, we can do all the work we want, but if we can't touch the policymakers, the people who are actually making decisions that are impacting everything that is happening in our communities, we're really just kind of running in a circle. So making sure that we're doing that. And I always like to end on that phrase that Tamika Mallory hit on during the presidential cycle when she said, we don't need allies. It's time that we have accomplices. It's one thing for me to be an ally and say, I support you, but I can support you and give you everything you need, but you have to go that final distance by yourself. We need accomplices that are going to say, I'm going to walk in with you. I'm going to kick that door down. I'm walking in that door with you to say, this isn't right, and this is how we need to fix it. So as we're moving forward, as we're taking that next step, we need those accomplices with us. And it doesn't. And again, I'm that utopia person. So I don't care if it's you're Black, you're white, you're Hispanic, Asian. If you're about the dismantling of systematic racism, you're about the dismantling of systematic oppression, dismantling the school to prison pipeline, disrupting all the things that's holding our minority children back, our minority communities back. I want you to be that accomplice right next to me and say, let's disrupt these systems together, because ultimately, from my perspective, we're stronger together, we're better together, and we began to show that next generation the power of what community is all about.
Dr. Benson, what do you think? Next steps as educators, what are our next steps?
Yeah, that was powerful. Thank you, Ingrid and Dr. Gibbs. That's powerful words. I don't know if mine's as passionate, but I think Jesse took the word, Jesse Graham, for it to kind of, I sign in all of my books, be the change you wish to see in the world, because that's truly my belief, right? Movements are a combination of individuals taking their responsibility and taking their movement, right? I think of the educators that I've worked with in the past. I still remember their names. Gwendolyn Belcher, she worked at Scroggs Elementary School. David Lyons, he was my mentor at Smith Middle School in Chapel Hill. Cesar Cruz, he's opened a school called Homies Empowerment for gang-involved youth out in LA. These are all individuals doing their part within their circle of influence. Right. And my part in my circle of influence is to found the Anti-Racist Leadership Institute. That's my part, right? To be side by side with folks to do my link in the chain, because I think the worst thing we can do is get apathetic and be like, it's just too big. We need these people to change in order for it to change. We need those people to do this. We need these people to make these, if we constantly pointing at other folks, and we're not being the change, and we're part of the problem. And so my firm belief is that we all need to be a part of it and learn how to do it better, because I didn't know how to do it great all the time. And I'm still learning, because we've all been indoctrinated in this doctrine of white supremacy. So I think I'm doing the right thing, but I'm sure me right now will be different than me 10 years from now, because I will have learned more. So we got to keep doing what we can do within our circle of influence, and keep learning as we go to figure out how to do it better. And that's the way I believe is the way forward.
You all, I told you an hour would go by so fast, and I wish we could go on for another hour and just keep digging, because this is growth. This is what learning and growth and connectedness feels like, is having hard conversations. And it's probably not as hard, right? Because we're all having these conversations openly. But I think that is a next step for me as a leader. We have to have these conversations openly. And I think Dr. Benson, not to keep going back to your book, but it's resonated with me ever since I read it, is we've got to be okay with people like me, a white administrator, being very uncomfortable, because it's not about comfortability. It's about embracing the conversations and being uncomfortable, because that's how shift and change and progress happens, is living in that space of uncomfortability. So you all, I don't want to leave the listeners away without connecting with you. So how can they find you on social media, your websites, whatever you use? How can they find you? Because I want them to get that opportunity that I have to follow the amazing work you continue to do.
So I'll jump in. So on Instagram, I'm just principal_Gibbs and then the number 2. So principal_GIBBS, number 2. On Twitter, just principal_Gibbs. Love to connect.
I'm on Twitter and LinkedIn as ACEs Ingrid. And I think you can probably see that in my title. I'm also, you can find me on Paces Connections website, which is just www.pacesconnection.com. Yeah, I think that's it. I'm on Instagram, but yeah, don't do that. But yeah, that's the best places to find me.
Perfect.
Yeah, and it's just I don't mean it to sound like how it's gonna come off, but if you just Google Tracey A. Benson, I got pretty good hits, right? I got a good tech team, right? So I'll come up, you can, find my website, my book, my TED Talk. I have a couple of book talks out there. Or you can go to my website, tracyabenson.com. So it's super easy, right? And I have a link tree there where I am all over social media.
So what Dr. Tracey Benson is saying, he doesn't know his login things. I'm kidding. Hey, but if you need his book, I have this, and you can see from my experience, it is highlighted. It is noted in so many ways, and such a powerful tool for me to be able to continue on my journey of a deeper understanding. So thank you all for listening. If you want to follow me, you can find that if you're watching it live right behind me. It's at Principal List on Twitter and Instagram. And please follow the Trauma Informed Educators Network podcast. If you love listening to the podcast, give us a review. Tell me what you think. Tell me who you want to hear from as we continue to meet. And I cannot wait to start my bi-weekly recordings again here in the coming weeks. And please continue these conversations. Continue them in your communities, in your schools, in your living rooms. I've tried this at Thanksgiving. It did not go over very well with my family. So you may want to leave those family holidays a little on the fringe, because it can get complicated. But nonetheless, thank you for listening. Thank you for being a listener of the podcast. And as always, please be safe. And if need be, wear a mask and just wash your hands.